In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world still sleeps and the digital demons have not yet awakened, Marcus understood what most men would never grasp, that the battle for his life would not be fought on any external battlefield, but within the fortress of his own mind. The realization came to him not as a thunderbolt of inspiration, but as a slow-burning truth that had been building for years. Every moment of weakness, every surrender to distraction, every compromise with his lesser self had been preparing him for this understanding. The modern world had become a vast machine designed to fragment attention, to scatter the human mind like seeds in a hurricane. Marcus had watched friends, colleagues, and family members fall victim to this invisible war, their potential dissolving into endless scrolling, their dreams disappearing into the black holes of social media feeds, their strength sapped by the constant ping of notifications that demanded immediate response. He had seen brilliant minds reduced to the attention span of goldfish, watched powerful ambitions crumble under the weight of digital distraction. But Marcus had also seen something else. He had witnessed the rare individuals who had learned to build walls around their focus, who had discovered that in an age where everyone was distracted, the focused man became king. These were the people who accomplished in months what others struggled to achieve in years, who built empires while others built Instagram stories, who carved their names into history while others carved nothing more lasting than tweets into the ether. The journey began with a simple observation that changed everything. Marcus noticed that his most productive, fulfilling, and meaningful work always happened during periods when he had eliminated distractions completely. Not reduced them, not managed them better, but eliminated them entirely. The correlation was so strong it was impossible to ignore. Every breakthrough, every moment of creative flow, every significant accomplishment had emerged from states of pure, undiluted focus. This led him to a radical experiment. For 30 days, Marcus would wage war against every form of distraction in his life. He would treat his attention like the most precious resource on earth, because he was beginning to understand that it actually was. Money could be earned back, time could not be recovered, but attention was the raw material from which all achievement was forged. Without it, everything else was meaningless noise. The first enemy Marcus identified was the most obvious but also the most insidious, the smartphone. This device, marketed as a tool of connection and productivity, had revealed itself to be something far more sinister: a portable distraction machine, a dopamine delivery system, a leash that kept him tethered to the opinions and demands of others. The average person, Marcus learned, checked their phone over 150 times per day. They were not using their phones were using them. Marcus began to see his smartphone not as a convenient tool but as a weapon pointed directly at his focus. Every notification was a tiny assault on his concentration, every app a portal designed to steal minutes that would add up to hours, days, years of his life. The phone companies, the app developers, the social media platforms, they had all hired teams of neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists to make their products as addictive as possible. They were literally fighting a war for his attention, and he had been losing without even realizing he was in a battle. The transformation began with simple but radical steps. Marcus removed all social media applications from his device. He turned off every notification except for actual phone calls and text messages from a carefully curated list of truly important people. He established phone-free zones in his home and created specific times when the device would be completely powered down. Most importantly, he banished the phone from his bedroom, understanding that the first moments of consciousness should belong to him, not to the digital world's demands. The withdrawal was immediate and intense. Marcus discovered that he had developed a genuine addiction. His hand would reflexively reach for the device even when it wasn't there, his mind would create phantom notification sounds, and he would feel anxious and disconnected when not constantly plugged into the digital stream. This reaction revealed how thoroughly the modern world had hijacked his natural reward systems, turning him into a lab rat pressing a lever for intermittent reinforcement. But, as the days passed without constant digital stimulation, something remarkable began to happen. The spaces between thoughts, which had been filled with the white noise of endless content consumption, began to expand. In these quiet moments, Marcus rediscovered something he had almost forgotten: the profound pleasure of deep thinking, of allowing ideas to develop and evolve without interruption, of following a single train of thought to its natural conclusion. He began to notice details in the physical world that had been invisible to him for years. The way morning light filtered through his window, the subtle changes in his neighborhood as seasons shifted, the expressions on people's faces during real, unmediated conversations. It was as if he had been living in a fog of distraction and was finally seeing clearly for the first time in years. The second phase of Marcus's focus revolution involved his work environment. He realized that his office had become a battlefield where good intentions went to die. Multiple monitors displayed multiple streams of information, browser tabs multiplied like cancer cells, and the constant flow of emails, messages, and alerts created an environment where deep work was virtually impossible. The modern office, he understood, was designed for the illusion of productivity rather than actual productivity. Marcus began to see that multitasking was not a skill but a myth, a dangerous delusion that decreased both the quality and quantity of actual work accomplished. Every time the brain switched between tasks, there was a cognitive cost, a moment of reorientation and refocusing that accumulated throughout the day like compound interest working in reverse. The people who believed they were good at multitasking were simply good at switching between tasks quickly. They were not actually accomplishing more, they were just creating more opportunities for error and confusion. The solution required architectural changes to his work life. Marcus created periods of complete isolation, hours when he was unreachable by email, phone, or any other form of digital communication. He learned to batch similar tasks together rather than jumping randomly between different types of work. He discovered the power of single tasking, of giving one project his complete attention until it was finished rather than keeping multiple projects in various states of incomplete progress. Most importantly, Marcus began to understand the difference between being busy and being productive. Busy people were always available, always responsive, always juggling multiple priorities. Productive people were selectively unavailable, strategically unresponsive, and ruthlessly focused on what actually mattered. The busy person felt important because they were always in demand, the productive person was important because they produced results. The transformation extended beyond work into every area of Marcus's life. He began to see that distraction was not just about technology or productivity, it was a fundamental approach to living. Distracted people were always somewhere else, always thinking about the next thing, always half present in their own lives. They ate meals while checking phones, had conversations while thinking about emails, and experienced life through the filter of how it would look on social media rather than how it actually felt in the moment. Marcus started practicing what he called monotasking in all areas of his life. When he ate without reading or watching screens. When he walked without listening to podcasts or making phone calls. When he had conversations, he gave people his complete attention without mental rehearsals of what he would say next. This simple practice revealed how rarely he had been fully present in his own life, how much of his experience had been diluted by the constant need to be somewhere else mentally. The results were dramatic and immediate. Food tasted better when he actually tasted it. Walks became meditative experiences rather than just transitions between destinations. Conversations became deeper and more meaningful when he stopped treating them as time to plan his next response. Marcus was discovering that presence was not just a nice ideal but a practical skill that dramatically improved the quality of every experience. As the weeks passed, Marcus began to understand that his battle against distraction was actually a battle for self-control, and self-control was the foundation of all personal power. Every time he resisted the urge to check his phone, every time he completed a task without switching to something else, every time he said no to an interruption, he was strengthening what psychologists called his willpower muscle. Like physical strength, mental discipline could be developed through consistent practice and challenge. This realization led Marcus to a deeper truth: the weak self that constantly sought distraction, that craved instant gratification, that avoided difficult tasks in favor of easy pleasures. This weak self was not his true identity but a collection of habits and impulses that could be changed. The strong self that could focus deeply, that could delay gratification, that could do difficult things, this was not some special talent he lacked but a capacity that could be developed. Marcus began to see every moment of temptation as an opportunity to choose which version of himself he wanted to strengthen. When his phone buzzed during deep work, he could either feed the weak self that craved immediate stimulation or strengthen the strong self that valued meaningful accomplishment. When he felt the urge to check social media, he could either indulge the weak self that sought validation and comparison or develop the strong self that found satisfaction in actual progress and achievement. The weak self, Marcus realized, was not evil, it was simply primitive. It operated on the ancient wiring of the human brain, which was designed for a world of immediate physical threats and scarce resources. In that ancient environment, it made sense to be constantly vigilant, to seek immediate rewards, to be easily distracted by anything that might represent opportunity or danger. But the modern world had weaponized these ancient instincts against human flourishing. The strong self, on the other hand, was a more recent evolutionary development, the capacity for delayed gratification, long-term thinking, and abstract goal pursuit. This was the part of human nature that could build civilizations, create art, pursue knowledge for its own sake, and find meaning in struggle and achievement. But this strong self was like a muscle that atrophied without use, and the modern world provided fewer and fewer opportunities to exercise it. Marcus began to design his life as a training ground for the strong self. He created challenges that required sustained focus, set goals that demanded delayed gratification, and put systems in place that made distraction difficult and concentration easy. He understood that willpower was a finite resource that could be depleted throughout the day, so he structured his most important work during times when his mental energy was highest and his capacity for distraction was lowest. The transformation was not without its costs. Friends and colleagues who were accustomed to his constant availability began to complain about his new boundaries. Some interpreted his focus as antisocial behavior, his selectivity as arrogance, his discipline as rigidity. Marcus learned that in a world where distraction was the norm, focus appeared almost antisocial, like a refusal to participate in the shared experience of scattered attention and fragmented living. But Marcus also began to attract different kinds of people, individuals who valued deep conversation over small talk, who appreciated quality over quantity, who understood that saying no to good things was often necessary to say yes to great things. He discovered a community of people who had made similar commitments to focus and found that their relationships, though fewer in number, were far more meaningful and satisfying. The social pressure to be constantly available and immediately responsive was intense. Marcus lived in a culture that had confused availability with importance, responsiveness with responsibility, and busyness with value. People expected instant replies to emails, immediate responses to messages, and constant participation in the digital conversation. To step outside this system felt like social and professional suicide. But Marcus discovered the opposite was true. As he became more selective about where he directed his attention, as he became less available for trivial requests and immediate responses, people began to value his time more highly. When he did respond to emails, people paid attention because they knew his responses were thoughtful rather than reflexive. When he made time for meetings, people came prepared because they knew his time was not given carelessly. Marcus was learning one of the most powerful principles of human psychology: scarcity creates value. By making his attention scarce, he made it valuable. By being selective about his focus, he made his contributions more impactful. The constantly available person becomes invisible, the selectively available person becomes indispensable. This principle extended far beyond professional relationships. In his personal life, Marcus found that being fully present for shorter periods was far more meaningful than being partially present for longer periods. Quality time was not measured in hours but in attention. A 30-minute conversation with complete focus was worth more than a 3-hour evening of distracted interaction. The deeper Marcus went into his focus experiment, the more he realized that attention was not just a productivity tool but the fundamental ingredient of a meaningful life. Everything that mattered, love, learning, creativity, achievement, connection, growth, required sustained attention to flourish. Distracted attention created a distracted life, while focused attention created a focused life. Marcus began to see that the modern epidemic of anxiety, depression, and general dissatisfaction was directly connected to the fragmentation of attention. When the mind was constantly switching between stimuli, it never had the opportunity to go deep enough to find real satisfaction. Shallow engagement with many things was less fulfilling than deep engagement with few things. The constantly distracted person was like someone trying to satisfy hunger by taking tiny bites of 100 different dishes, always consuming but never truly nourished. The practice of sustained focus began to reveal experiences that Marcus had forgotten were possible. When he read books without interruption for hours at a time, he entered states of absorption that were almost transcendent. When he worked on creative projects with complete concentration, he experienced what psychologists call flow, a state where time seemed to disappear and the work felt effortless despite being challenging. These peak experiences of focus reminded Marcus of what human consciousness was capable of when it was not scattered and fragmented. He began to understand that the constantly distracted life was not just less productive but less alive. It cut people off from the deepest sources of satisfaction and meaning that required sustained attention to access. As his practice deepened, Marcus began to see patterns in how different types of distraction affected him. Some distractions were like sugar, they provided immediate stimulation followed by a crash that left him less capable than before. Other distractions were like alcohol, they seemed to relax and entertain but actually impaired his capacity for clear thinking. Still others were like addictive drugs, they created increasingly intense cravings while providing diminishing satisfaction. Social media, Marcus realized, was the most dangerous because it combined all these elements. It provided intermittent reinforcement like a slot machine, social validation like a drug, and endless novelty like a sugar high. It was designed by some of the smartest people in the world to be as engaging as possible, which meant it was designed to hijack the natural reward systems of the brain and turn them against their owner's best interests. Marcus began to understand that protecting his focus was not just about productivity or achievement, it was about protecting his capacity for happiness itself. The distracted mind was always seeking the next stimulation, the next reward, the next hit of novelty or validation. This constant seeking prevented the mind from ever arriving at genuine satisfaction. The focused mind, on the other hand, could find deep satisfaction in sustained engagement with challenging and meaningful activities. The transformation was not linear or easy. Marcus faced constant temptation to return to his old patterns, especially during difficult or boring tasks when distraction offered easy escape. He learned that building focus was like building physical fitness, it required consistent practice, gradual progression, and the willingness to be uncomfortable while new capacities developed. There were days when Marcus felt like he was fighting against the entire structure of modern life. Every device, every platform, every system seemed designed to capture and fragment attention. Walking through the world with a commitment to focused attention was like trying to maintain sobriety in a world where everyone was drunk and where alcohol was being offered at every turn. But Marcus also discovered that he was not alone. Throughout history, the people who had accomplished the most meaningful work, the artists, scientists, entrepreneurs, and leaders who had actually changed the world, had all developed the capacity for sustained focus. They had all learned to protect their attention from the distractions of their time, whether those distractions were social pressures, entertainment, or the busy work that masqueraded as important activity. Marcus began studying the habits and practices of people he admired, looking for patterns in how they structured their lives to support deep focus. He discovered that virtually all of them had developed systems for protecting their most creative and productive hours from interruption. They had learned to say no ruthlessly to requests that did not align with their most important goals. They had created physical and mental environments that supported concentration rather than fragmentation. The more Marcus learned about the science of attention and focus, the more he understood that he was not fighting against his own nature but fighting to reclaim his own nature. The human brain was designed to focus deeply when necessary. This capacity had allowed humans to create tools, solve complex problems, and build civilizations. But this same brain could be hijacked by systems designed to exploit its reward mechanisms for commercial purposes. Marcus realized that maintaining focus in the modern world was not just a personal challenge but a form of resistance against systems that profited from his distraction. Every moment of sustained attention was a small act of rebellion against a culture that wanted to turn him into a consumer rather than a creator, a reactor rather than an actor, a follower rather than a leader. The deeper insight came when Marcus understood that the battle was not really between focus and distraction but between two different versions of himself. The weak self was the version that sought comfort, avoided difficulty, craved immediate gratification, and was easily influenced by external pressures. The strong self was the version that could tolerate discomfort, embrace challenge, delay gratification, and act according to internal values rather than external pressures. Every choice throughout the day was a vote for one of these two selves. When Marcus chose to complete a difficult task rather than check social media, he was voting for the strong self. When he chose to have a real conversation rather than scroll through his phone, he was voting for the strong self. When he chose to read a challenging book rather than watch entertainment, he was voting for the strong self. Marcus began to see that the weak self was not destroyed through brutal self-discipline or harsh self-criticism but through consistent choices that starved it of the behaviors that kept it strong while feeding the behaviors that strengthened its alternative. Like a garden, the self that was watered and nourished would grow while the self that was neglected would wither. The weak self thrived on instant gratification, constant stimulation, external validation, and the avoidance of difficulty. The strong self thrived on delayed gratification, sustained focus, internal validation, and the embrace of meaningful challenges. By structuring his life to make the strong self's preferred behaviors easier and more rewarding while making the weak self's preferred behaviors more difficult and less rewarding, Marcus was gradually shifting the balance of power within his own psyche. This process required what Marcus came to think of as environmental design, creating conditions that supported the behaviors he wanted while making unwanted behaviors more difficult. This meant removing apps from his phone rather than relying on willpower not to use them. It meant keeping books visible and accessible while keeping the television remote in a drawer. It meant scheduling focused work time in his calendar rather than hoping to find time for it spontaneously. Marcus learned that successful people did not have more willpower than unsuccessful people, they had better systems. They designed their lives so that the right choices were easier than the wrong choices, so that focused work was more convenient than distracted work, so that healthy behaviors were more accessible than unhealthy behaviors. As the months passed, Marcus began to notice changes that went far beyond productivity or achievement. His capacity for enjoyment deepened as his ability to focus improved. Food tasted better when he ate without distraction. Music was more moving when he listened without doing other things. Conversations were more satisfying when he gave people his complete attention. Exercise was more energizing when he focused on the physical sensations rather than trying to entertain his mind with podcasts or music. Marcus was discovering that presence was not just a spiritual concept but a practical skill that enhanced every aspect of experience. The focused mind could extract more satisfaction, more learning, more growth, and more joy from any given activity than the distracted mind could extract from multiple activities happening simultaneously. The transformation also affected his relationships in unexpected ways. As Marcus became more selective about how he spent his time and attention, he naturally began spending more time with people who appreciated depth over breadth, quality over quantity. His friendships became fewer but deeper. His romantic relationships became more intimate because he was more present. His professional relationships became more productive because he brought his full capabilities to every interaction. Some people in Marcus's life struggled with his new boundaries and priorities. Friends who were accustomed to his constant availability felt rejected when he stopped responding immediately to every message. Colleagues who expected him to be always accessible felt ignored when he established periods of focused work. Family members who were used to partial attention during gatherings felt excluded when he put his phone away completely. But Marcus learned that these reactions often revealed more about others' relationships with distraction than about his own choices. People who were uncomfortable with his focus were often uncomfortable with their own lack of focus. People who criticized his boundaries often lacked boundaries of their own. People who interpreted his selectivity as rejection were often people who equated love with constant availability rather than quality attention. The most profound realization came when Marcus understood that the capacity for sustained focus was actually the capacity for love. To focus completely on something or someone was to love it fully in that moment. Distracted attention was diluted love, spread so thin across multiple objects that it lost its power to nourish any of them adequately. When Marcus focused completely on his work, he was loving his work. When he focused completely on a friend during conversation, he was loving that friend. When he focused completely on a book while reading, he was loving the ideas and the learning. When he focused completely on a meal while eating, he was loving the food and the nourishment. Focus was not cold or calculating, it was the warmest possible engagement with life. This understanding transformed Marcus's relationship with the concept of sacrifice. He had initially thought that protecting his focus required giving up pleasure, connection, and spontaneity. But he discovered that focused attention actually multiplied pleasure, deepened connection, and enabled a more meaningful form of spontaneity. He was not giving up experiences, he was having fewer experiences but experiencing them more completely. The disciplined life, Marcus learned, was not restrictive but expansive. By saying no to many things, he could say yes more completely to the things that mattered most. By being selective about his attention, he could give higher quality attention to his chosen focuses. By being protective of his time, he could be more generous with his time when he chose to share it. As Marcus's practice of focus deepened, he began to experience what he could only describe as a different quality of consciousness. The scattered, anxious, always seeking mind that had been his normal state began to settle into something more stable and peaceful. He could think more clearly, feel more deeply, and act more purposefully. It was as if the static that had always been running in the background of his mind had been turned off, allowing him to hear his own thoughts and feelings with greater clarity. This inner clarity began to affect every aspect of his decision-making. When the mind was not constantly distracted, it became much easier to distinguish between what was truly important and what was merely urgent, between what aligned with his values and what simply demanded immediate attention, between what contributed to his long-term goals and what provided only short-term stimulation. Marcus realized that most people were not making conscious choices about how to spend their time and attention, they were simply reacting to whatever was loudest, most urgent, or most immediately rewarding. Without the capacity for sustained focus, it was almost impossible to pursue long-term goals that required consistent effort over extended periods. The distracted mind was trapped in a cycle of immediate response and short-term thinking. The focused mind, on the other hand, could step back from the immediate pressures and demands to consider what was truly worth pursuing. It could delay gratification in service of larger purposes, resist urgent distractions in favor of important projects, and maintain consistent effort even when the results were not immediately visible. This capacity for long-term thinking and sustained effort began to compound in Marcus's life in remarkable ways. Projects that would have been impossible with a distracted mind became not only possible but enjoyable with a focused mind. Goals that would have required years of scattered effort could be accomplished in months of concentrated effort. Skills that seemed impossibly difficult to develop became approachable through consistent daily practice. Marcus began to understand why the focused person had such an enormous advantage in the modern world. While everyone else was being pulled in multiple directions by competing demands and distractions, the focused person could direct all their energy toward their most important objectives. While others were spreading their efforts across dozens of projects and priorities, the focused person was concentrating their efforts on the few things that would produce the greatest results. This principle of concentrated effort versus distributed effort became one of Marcus's most important insights. A small amount of force applied consistently to the same point could achieve far more than a large amount of force scattered across many points. 10 minutes of daily focused practice on a skill would produce more improvement than an hour of distracted practice once a week. 30 minutes of deep work every day would produce more results than an entire day of shallow work once a month. The compound effect of sustained focus began to show up in every area of Marcus's life. His health improved as he focused completely on his workouts and meals rather than exercising while watching television or eating while reading. His relationships deepened as he gave people his complete attention during conversations rather than partial attention while multitasking. His learning accelerated as he read books with full concentration rather than skimming multiple sources simultaneously. Most importantly, Marcus began to experience a sense of integrity and authenticity that had been missing from his distracted life. When he was scattered across multiple focuses, he never felt like he was showing up as his full self in any situation. He was always partially somewhere else, always thinking about something else, always divided against himself. The focused life allowed him to be completely present and, therefore, completely himself in each moment. This sense of wholeness and integration began to affect how others perceived and responded to Marcus. When someone gives you their complete attention, you can feel it, just as you can feel when someone is distracted or preoccupied. People began to seek out Marcus's company not because he was entertaining or exciting but because he was fully present. In a world where everyone was partially absent, complete presence became a rare and valuable gift. Marcus realized that the ability to focus was actually the ability to care deeply. Distraction was a form of numbness, a way of avoiding the intensity of full engagement. Focus required vulnerability, the willingness to care enough about something to give it complete attention, knowing that such attention might reveal uncomfortable truths, difficult challenges, or painful realities. The distracted person could avoid confronting difficult truths by keeping their attention moving constantly. They could avoid the discomfort of sustained effort by switching to easier tasks whenever things became challenging. They could avoid the vulnerability of deep relationships by keeping all interactions at a superficial level. Distraction was not just a problem, it was often a solution, a way of managing anxiety and avoiding difficulty. But Marcus discovered that this apparent solution created much bigger problems. By avoiding the discomfort of focus, the distracted person also missed out on the rewards that only focus could provide. They could never develop mastery in any area because mastery required sustained attention. They could never build deep relationships because intimacy required consistent presence. They could never achieve significant goals because achievement required persistent effort over time. The focused life was more challenging in the short term but far more rewarding in the long term. It required the willingness to be uncomfortable, to struggle with difficult problems, to persist through periods of frustration and apparent lack of progress. But this willingness to engage with difficulty was what made growth and achievement possible. Marcus began to see that the weak self was not actually weak because it was bad or evil, it was weak because it always chose the easy path. It avoided difficulty, sought comfort, and pursued immediate gratification. These choices felt good in the moment but left the person weaker and less capable over time. The strong self chose difficulty, tolerated discomfort, and delayed gratification. These choices were harder in the moment but built strength and capability over time. Every moment of sustained focus was a moment of choosing difficulty over ease, long-term benefit over short-term comfort, growth over stagnation. These choices accumulated over time to create two very different kinds of lives. The person who consistently chose these ended up with a difficult life, weak capabilities, shallow relationships, and unrealized potential. The person who consistently chose difficulty ended up with an easier life, strong capabilities, deep relationships, and fulfilled potential. This understanding gave Marcus a new framework for making decisions. Instead of asking what would feel good in the moment, he began asking what would make him stronger over time. Instead of seeking immediate pleasure, he began seeking meaningful challenge. Instead of avoiding discomfort, he began embracing it as a sign that he was growing. The transformation was not without setbacks and struggles. There were days when Marcus felt overwhelmed by the intensity of focused living, when he longed for the numbing distraction of mindless entertainment or social media scrolling. The focused life was more vivid and intense, which meant experiencing negative emotions more fully as well as positive ones. But Marcus learned that these difficult emotions were often signals, indicators that something in his life needed attention or adjustment. The distracted life had numbed these signals, making it impossible to respond appropriately to problems or challenges. The focused life made these signals clearer and stronger, enabling more effective responses and better long-term outcomes. As Marcus continued to develop his capacity for focus, he began to understand that he was not just changing his habits or improving his productivity, he was fundamentally transforming his relationship with his own mind. The mind that had once been his enemy, constantly pulling him toward distraction and away from his goals, was becoming his greatest ally. This transformation required patience and compassion toward himself. The weak self that craved distraction was not something to be destroyed through harsh discipline but something to be gradually transformed through consistent practice and understanding. Marcus learned to work with his psychology rather than against it, creating conditions that made focus more appealing and distraction less attractive. The key insight was that willpower was not a character trait but a skill that could be developed. Like physical strength, mental discipline grew stronger through consistent exercise and appropriate challenge. But, also like physical strength, it could be depleted through overuse and needed recovery time to regenerate. Marcus began to structure his days to use his willpower strategically rather than exhausting it through constant battles with temptation. He made important decisions and did his most challenging work when his mental energy was highest, typically in the early hours of the day. He created systems and environments that reduced the need for willpower by making good choices easier and bad choices harder. This strategic approach to willpower management was far more effective than relying on motivation or inspiration. Motivation was unreliable, present some days and absent others. Willpower was finite, strong at some times and depleted at others. But systems were consistent, they worked regardless of how Marcus felt or how much mental energy he had available. The systems Marcus created were simple but powerful. He prepared his environment the night before so that focused work was the easiest option in the morning. He used website blockers and app restrictions to make distraction more difficult during work hours. He established physical cues and triggers that automatically initiated periods of deep focus. He created rewards for completing focused work sessions and consequences for giving in to distraction. These external systems gradually became internal habits. The behaviors that had initially required conscious effort and willpower became automatic responses. The capacity for focus that had once felt forced and unnatural began to feel normal and effortless. Marcus was not just developing better habits, he was developing a new identity as a focused person. This identity shift was perhaps the most profound aspect of the transformation. Instead of seeing himself as someone who was trying to be more focused, Marcus began to see himself as someone who was naturally focused. Instead of fighting against distraction, he began to simply not be interested in distracting activities. Instead of forcing himself to concentrate, concentration became his default state. The identity of a focused person made different choices feel natural and automatic. A focused person didn't need to struggle not to check social media, they simply weren't interested in social media. A focused person didn't need to force themselves to complete projects, they were naturally drawn to the satisfaction of completion. A focused person didn't need to resist distractions, they were more attracted to meaningful work than to meaningless diversions. This identity transformation revealed something important about human nature. People tend to act in accordance with their self-concept. Someone who sees themselves as disorganized will naturally make disorganized choices. Someone who sees themselves as undisciplined will naturally make undisciplined choices. Someone who sees themselves as focused will naturally make focused choices. Marcus realized that changing his behavior had been important, but changing his identity had been transformational. The behavior changes had required constant effort and attention. The identity change made the right behaviors feel natural and automatic. He was no longer trying to be focused, he simply was focused. As Marcus's reputation for focus and reliability grew, new opportunities began to present themselves. People sought him out for important projects because they knew he would give them complete attention. Employers offered him positions of greater responsibility because they trusted his ability to concentrate on what mattered most. Clients paid premium prices for his services because they valued the quality that came from undivided attention. Marcus discovered that in a world where everyone was distracted, the focused person had an enormous competitive advantage. While others were juggling multiple priorities and producing mediocre results across all of them, Marcus was concentrating his efforts and producing exceptional results in his chosen areas. While others were spreading themselves thin and burning out, Marcus was going deep and building sustainable excellence. The economic benefits of focus were substantial, but they were not the most important rewards. The deeper satisfaction came from the sense of living with integrity and purpose. Marcus was no longer scattered across dozens of shallow pursuits, he was concentrated on a few meaningful ones. He was no longer reacting to whatever demanded his attention, he was proactively choosing where to direct his focus based on his values and goals. This sense of agency and intentionality transformed every aspect of Marcus's experience. He was no longer a victim of his circumstances or his impulses, he was the conscious architect of his own life. He could choose what to pay attention to, how to spend his time, and which version of himself to strengthen through his daily choices. The man Marcus had become bore little resemblance to the distracted, scattered person he had been just months earlier. The weak self that had been ruled by impulses and external demands had been gradually replaced by a strong self that was guided by values and long-term vision. The transformation had not been dramatic or sudden, it had been the result of thousands of small choices, each one a vote for the person he wanted to become. Marcus understood that this transformation was not a destination but a practice. The capacity for focus needed to be maintained and developed continuously. The systems that supported concentration needed to be refined and adapted as circumstances changed. The identity of a focused person needed to be reinforced through consistent choices and behaviors. But Marcus also understood that he had discovered something invaluable, the secret to living with power and purpose in a distracted world. He had learned that the person who could protect their focus could protect their future. He had learned that the person who could control their attention could control their life. Most importantly, he had learned that the person who could destroy their weak self through disciplined practice could never be destroyed by others, because they had already conquered their greatest enemy, their own undisciplined mind. The battle for focus was ultimately the battle for freedom, the freedom to choose what deserved attention, the freedom to pursue meaningful goals over extended periods, the freedom to become the person one was capable of becoming rather than remaining trapped in patterns of distraction and mediocrity. In a world designed to scatter attention and fragment consciousness, the focused person was not just more productive, they were more alive, more present, and more powerful than they had ever imagined possible. Marcus had learned that distraction truly was defeat, but not because it prevented productivity or achievement. Distraction was defeat because it prevented the full experience of being human, the deep satisfaction of sustained engagement, the joy of complete presence, the power of conscious choice, and the dignity of living according to one's highest values rather than one's lowest impulses. The focused life was not just more successful, it was more meaningful, more satisfying, and more authentically human than any alternative. In the end, Marcus discovered that the greatest victory was not over external enemies but over the internal forces that kept him from becoming who he was meant to be. The focused mind was not just a tool for achievement, it was the foundation of a life lived with intention, integrity, and authentic power. And, in a world where everyone was fighting for attention, the person who could give their complete attention had already won the most important battle of all.